Do you know Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, the mother of James? They were disciples, three of the most prominent women out of the many women who followed him. Surely you must know them. How about some of the male disciples? Peter, James, John? Recognize their names? They were like the true inner circle. This one time they hiked up a mountain with Jesus and they saw who he truly was, saw the glory of God shining from him. They even saw Moses and Elijah there with him. And there was this thunderous voice that said, "This is my son, listen to him." I'm sure you've heard of the disciple named Judas. Respectable guy, logical. He was the treasurer, Kept track of the money for Jesus and the closest disciples, good at his job. This one time, a woman came to Jesus and poured an entire bottle of perfume on his head while the disciples were so angry and they let her have it. What a waste, they said. Could have sold the perfume and given the money to the poor, they said. Can't imagine what Judas, the treasurer, must have thought. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She's done a beautiful thing for me. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." That wasn't long before he was, crucified. Jesus had talked about what was going to happen to him before, and no one wanted to hear it, or they just didn't understand what he was on about. But that woman who poured the perfume on his head, she knew. This one time when Jesus had said he was going to suffer and die and then come back to life after death, Peter took him aside and was livid. He just started yelling at Jesus, telling him that that couldn't happen. But Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your mind on earthly things, not heavenly things." He said that to Peter. I'd never seen Jesus that irate. Looking back, though, I guess I can understand why Jesus got upset. Another time, right after Jesus had been talking the same way, but this time even worse, he said that the Son of Man, because that's how Jesus talked about himself, would be mocked, spat upon, flogged, and killed, but then after 3 days, he would rise again. You know how James and John responded to that? They came up to Jesus and said, "We want 2 places of honor when you set up this new kingdom that you're starting. One of us on your right and the other on the left." Jesus was pretty calm about that doozy, but the other disciples weren't. I mean, why should James and John get the important places, the best places? Why not any of them? Jesus just calmly told them the way it was, that his kingdom was nothing like the way things are usually set up, with places of honor and everyone worrying about who is most important or most successful. In his kingdom, the greatest people are the servants, and Jesus himself was there to serve and not be served, even to the point of giving up his life for the sake of the people that would be welcomed into his kingdom, which was actually anyone. You probably know what happened to Judas. He sold Jesus out, betrayed him, gave him up to the authorities. I don't really know why he did it. Was it for the money? Had he lost faith in Jesus? Maybe he thought he saw the writing on the wall for this kingdom that Jesus was talking about that was probably going to fail. Maybe he saw a way out and a way to gain at least something for himself as he went. And so he took the opportunity. Peter, of course, wanted to stand up for Jesus so badly. I heard that he was the one who, when Jesus was arrested, pulled out a sword to try and stop the soldiers and ended up cutting off someone's ear. Maybe Judas thought money was the answer. And maybe Peter thought it was fighting. Peter tried hard to follow Jesus after he was taken. But when a group of people outside the government headquarters questioned him, he pretended to not even know who Jesus was. Maybe Peter thought it really was over. Wouldn't blame him if he felt that way, really. And James and John, what about them? Not really sure. Most of the disciples all just ran away, disappeared into the crowd. Some say that John did go see Jesus while he hung on the cross, said he went there with, a correction. It wasn't that most of the disciples ran away. It was that most of the male disciples ran away. John was there, yes. He was there with Jesus' mother, with Mary Magdalene, with another Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. That's right, the women were there. Those disciples were there. And that's important. These disciples, the Marys and Salome, they stuck together. Really different than what all the men seem to be doing. All doing their own thing, betraying, denying, backstabbing, vying for position and gain. I'm sure it all started pure at the beginning, all their hearts in the right place. And for most of them, there's still a hopeful future, I'm sure. But when the heat got turned up, it got ugly. It was like they were trying to somehow get control of the situation or something, as if fighting was the answer. Or maybe money was the answer, or thinking maybe that if I were in the vice president position, if I were the right-hand man, then I'd be able to sort all this out. And just look where it all went. Out of control. But the female disciples, they're more the model, maybe, coming together at the cross. Together is right, isn't it? Community. When things get bad, most of us isolate. We try to I'll just handle it myself. We don't ask for help. But the Marys and Salome, they were together, weren't they? It was hard, but they were together. And it's not like being in community was actually the solution for something. Something else was the solution. Something else was at work that was outside of themselves. Something else was going on. The Spirit of God was going to do something. The women weren't trying to make it happen. What these disciples did was be present with each other, in community, grieving together. And they had no idea if God would do anything. But maybe this is what waiting on God in faith means. The Marys and Salome, they were present. They were there when Jesus died. And we actually know from eyewitnesses that there were many other women there too. Now, you could just say, well, it was safer for them. You could say the Romans were not going to arrest a bunch of grieving women, but probably would have started rounding up the men if they'd had the chance. You could say that. Probably true. But you could also say that while Jesus was on a cross, God was up to something with the disciples who were there, present in community. And in the morning, just like the woman who had poured perfume on Jesus' head, the two Marys and Salome went together, bringing spices to the tomb to anoint the body. This is normal grieving activity. They had no idea what they were going to experience. They didn't know what God had done. But the tomb was open. The stone rolled away from the entrance. They went in. Jesus' body wasn't there. Just a young man dressed in a white robe who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. It's interesting how Mark's gospel tells it. the three women going to the tomb are all named. The two Marys, Salome. That is actually unusual in ancient literature for women to be named. Even in much of the Bible, we do have a lot of women's names in the Bible, but there's lots of places in the Bible where the women are side characters. Female characters go unnamed or unnoticed in ancient literature, but here, the women's names are all there, and the one man in our foundational story is unnamed. A young man sitting in the tomb. Mark doesn't even say whether he's an angel or not. Talk about angels, but Mark just says young man. The young man tells the three disciples that Jesus is risen, and then says, "Go and tell his male disciples and Peter that he will meet you in Galilee." In Mark's account, in the New International Version, we read this: "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." A strange ending for our triumphant Easter celebrations. Trembling and bewildered, saying nothing to anyone out of fear. It's a great ending, actually. That's the end of Mark's gospel. That's how it ends. There's no extra resurrection appearances in Mark's gospel. They're all in Matthew and Luke and John. So I'm glad we have those. But Mark's gospel just ends like this, trembling and afraid. It's actually a great ending. I read a post on social media recently where someone mentioned that they loved this reading for Easter because it ends this way. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And yet, here we all are, still telling this story. So how did that happen if they didn't tell anyone? I'd often thought that Mark might have been portraying the women here as afraid to speak because it is the opposite of how we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be so joyful because of the resurrection and the reality of new life because of Christ, so joyful that we want to spread the good news. I thought this ending of Mark was Mark's way of saying, don't be like them. I know it can be scary, but tell people. But what if they were scared because they were vulnerable? What if they were scared to say anything because it would be 3 women going to 11 men? It would be the ones who had been faithful, who stood at the cross, who grieved at the tomb, having to go to the ones who had wanted the positions of greatness and had cut off someone's ear with a sword. Maybe they were afraid to speak because it's pretty hard to break out of an entire culture telling you to stay silent. Even when you are told to say something by, most likely, an angel sitting in the empty tomb of the King of Kings, it can still be hard. Trembling and bewildered, they fled from the tomb. The gospel writer Mark and the Holy Spirit in inspiring the writer and Jesus himself seem to be doing something very different. They all center the vulnerable. And it happens often in this gospel with all kinds of people. In this particular story, the Easter story, the ones who get centered in Mark's gospel, the vulnerable ones are the 3 women who are the very first witnesses to the empty tomb. He is risen. He is risen. It is a vindication and an inauguration of everything Jesus had been driving at. That kingdom which he enacted and of which he spoke is established by very different means than swords or money or sitting in the positions of power. This kingdom, where the first are last and the last are first, has been won in sacrifice and service, in perfume being poured on the head of the king, not to crown him, but to prepare him for his burial after being rejected and crucified. Jesus said, Wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. And yet, this unnamed woman in Mark's gospel is rarely talked about. Why? Maybe it's because we're only just beginning to acknowledge that people who don't look and sound like the person delivering this sermon right now are the very ones who the Spirit chooses to place at the center of the story that God is telling. And not only that, they are the ones who God sends with the good news. So we need to tear down any barriers still in place that cause them any fear, so that they will speak, and we better be sure to listen. Christ is risen. There is life after death, and a whole new kind of life in the here and now is constituted because of Christ, one where we are continually remade in his likeness. But of course, we're not the ones doing the remaking, are we? We simply do what the women did. Show up together. It is God doing the remaking. God has been up to this all along. And every so often, we just get a glimpse of it. Sometimes a big one, like the disciples, the 3 women in the empty tomb. And just like them, do glimpses, big and little, of this upside-down kingdom, this new creation, this reconstituted and remade people, do these glimpses ever get us bewildered? And what a joyful bewilderment.